Thank you to everyone who's here. Thank you especially to Myra who's here. I'm going to give you a formal introduction from something that she sent me in a moment. But first, I just want to share that I came across her book as an article that I read, um, a review of her book, and it's been like one of the more meaningful parts of my year in the past year. So it was amazing to be able to reach out to her to see if she wanted to participate in the speaker series. And then she and I've had a chance to talk, which has been really like a thought-provoking jumping off point. And so I feel like excited and hopeful that it will be meaningful to kind of the group as well. Um, I think just to kind of preface what's been so meaningful to me is I think that oftentimes in medicine and in this group, we try to talk about deep things, if that makes sense. And oftentimes we're doing like some kind of approximation of it, like we're talking about love or we're talking about something that like we want to feel very connected to. But there's also like this kind of like emotional guardrail of being too vulnerable. And Myra's book is just like very vulnerable. She'll tell you a little bit more about the content in a moment. Um, but I think that on a deep level, it kind of just tore back all those layers of kind of facade that we kind of have in our professional lives and in our personal lives. And in an amazing way, Myra, you just kind of shared with anyone who wanted to read your book about the joys and the pains and the suffering and the grief and all these different kind of really raw experiences of being Havi's mom. And I'm just like really, really, really grateful for that. And I'm excited for this talk. Just to give you the more formal introduction as well, Myra is an award-winning author of 57 Fridays, Losing Our Daughter, Finding Our Way, and founder of Emotion, a nonprofit organization created to support community, movement, and ritual to enhance coping and resilience. Myra's life changed when her older daughter, Havi, died on January 20th, 2021 of Tay-Sachs disease. Myra is a certified compassionate bereavement care provider, holds an MBA in social impact from Boston University, and graduated with a BA cum laude from Dartmouth College. Myra serves on the board of the Courageous Parents Network and lives in Boston, Massachusetts with her husband, Matt, their second daughter, Kaya, and son, Ezra. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor over to you, Myra.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Kristen. And Adam, I think our conversation and our connection has also been one of the most meaningful things that's happened to me this year. So it's a true honor to be a part of this speaker series. I'm going to, and thank you for making the time. I'm not from medicine, but I imagine you are inundated right now. And so appreciate the time you're taking to be here with me, with us today. I'm going to share some slides. Most of them are actually photographs of Havi. And the way that the talk is going to go is I'll give a little bit of framing, like why I sort of care about grief work, why I think it matters beyond my own personal story of loss. Then I'll share my story of loss, and then Adam and I will be in conversation and invite you to jump in. So I'm going to share my screen, and Kristen or Adam, just tell me if you can't, if it's coming up funny. Okay, we're good. So Francis Weller is a renowned psychotherapist and author, and he writes, "It's our unexpressed sorrows, the congested stories of loss, when left unattended, that block access to the soul. To be able to freely move in and out of the soul's inner chambers, we have to clear the way, and this requires finding meaningful ways to speak of sorrow." Adam alluded to this, but this session is going to be about speaking of sorrow in sort of the most vulnerable, raw, real way, the way that I know how. And this is the intention for the time together. And intention comes from the Latin root tendere. Tendere means to stretch. And so when we do something physically difficult, we typically stretch a little bit beforehand. We know that's good for our bodies. And the same is true for stretching before we do sort of emotional work, because it creates space for us to hold hard and heavy things. I won't ask you to do this now, but an exercise that I often do with folks that I think is really powerful, that gets at a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, which is how do you hold two seemingly opposite feelings at the same time and let it expand you? So how do you hold hope and heaviness? That is sort of how do you embody the unity of opposites theory? And one way to kind of check in with ourselves on this is, it's a silly 6-word exercise, but reflect on kind of what is one story of hope you're carrying in 6 words only. My example is, when my toddler laughs until pee. And what do I wish someone knew about the heaviness that I'm holding? It's ask me about her big eyes. And so when we engage in an exercise like this, we sort of start to recognize which of these, as friends, colleagues, practitioners, which of these are we turning towards on a daily basis and which are we neglecting? And therefore, sort of how is that impacting our capacity to be of service to ourselves and others? I define grief as the human process of moving with loss. And there's all kinds of loss types. You can kind of scan this slide. We're not going to stay here long, but I urge you to sort of connect with this content from a loss experience that's most resonant for you, and sort of see how you move with this conversation after doing that. But despite the fact that grief is kind of everywhere, we receive really powerful messages from society that this culture of sort of amnesia and anesthesia, forget and numb, that grief's a problem to be solved, something to get over, a misunderstanding really of Dr. Kubler-Ross's work on the 5 stages of grief, that it's even un-American, like when the going gets tough, the tough gets going, or that it's not to be discussed. And I think these messages don't come from a place of malintent. They come from fear, that we're afraid we might say or do the wrong thing, that we can't do enough. Maybe we're afraid of our own pain. We might be afraid that something about grief or loss is contagious. I get that a lot in my kind of lived experience. And ultimately, maybe we're afraid of feeling. So this is really the last text heavy slide, but as we're moving, sort of consider the ways that some of those messages that we get from society writ large around grief, how do they show up in your community, in your work? And then kind of secondly, like, where might they show up in you? And so to what extent, if at all, have we internalized these messages? And I come to this space, as Adam shared, as a bereaved mom. I never imagined that I would be speaking, working, writing, studying grief literacy, walking from cafes, holding the Handbook of Thanatology, which is the study of death and dying. But I do now, and I do because our first daughter, Havi, was born September 4th, 2018. She was born 2 years to the day of our wedding anniversary. My husband, Matt, and I met through I'll tell you a little bit of our love story, through a teammate and best friend of mine from Dartmouth. I played soccer there. And after I graduated, Matt and I reconnected in San Francisco. I was doing work for a community-based organization. He was finishing his MD PhD at Stanford in cancer immunotherapy. And we started dating, fell in love, moved to Boston for Matt's residency in internal medicine, underwent all of our preconception genetic testing. We are both Ashkenazi Jewish, and so are at high risk of passing a whole host of really horrible genetic diseases on to our offspring. And so we were good students, learned in Hebrew school that thanks to previous generations, we could now test for lots of these. And so we did. I got tested and learned that I was a carrier for Tay-Sachs, which meant that Matt needed to be tested as well. Matt's carrier screening test came back that he was not a carrier for Tay-Sachs. He was reported negative. And so because it is an autosomal recessive disorder, we were in the clear to try to grow our family. And we did. I got pregnant and Havi was born on this kind of magical day. And the first year of her life unfolded rather undramatically, actually. We were first-time parents trying to keep sort of type A tendencies at bay. Havi wasn't making the sort of progress that some of her peers were, but we weren't really worried. And we were exhausted and impatient and confused and full of joy, all the full spectrum. And then at her first year pediatrician appointment, we received a developmental delay diagnosis. Havi wasn't reaching the milestones that she needed to reach. She wasn't crawling particularly well. She certainly wasn't pulling up to stand. She wasn't babbling. And so we were referred to early intervention and underwent all sorts of physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. Really, we were putting Havi through sort of two-a-days. As athletes, I think at that point in our lives, our mentality was we can kind of outwork anything. And we were fortunate enough to have kind of the resources to try. And so we did. But Havi wasn't making progress. And about 2 months into that effort, so she's about 14 months old now, we went to our first neurologist, and that neurologist saw Havi and she sort of charmed the pants off of him. She was blowing bubbles and laughing and having a particularly good day. And he ran some tests and said, she's going to be fine. I see lots of very sick children and she's not one of them. Just be patient. But then she started to regress, which we know is never good. She went from sort of being able to sit up with beautiful posture to slouching. And so we saw a second neurologist, and that neurologist actually diagnosed Havi with cerebral palsy. And that was a devastating diagnosis, but ultimately wrong. And we were then referred to our third neurologist, whose name is Dr. Sid. And Dr. Sid saw Havi for a clinical exam and then wanted to do an MRI based on the cerebral palsy diagnosis. There was nothing traumatic about Hav's birth. And so the assumption at this point was that Havi's cerebral palsy was genetic. On Dr. Sid's clinical exam, this was December 17th, 2019. So I'm actually coming up to what we call Diagnosis Day next week. And part of why I feel so honored to be in this space is because it's a particularly hard time of year. And so just so beautiful that Adam reached out and thought that our story could be of some service to each of you. So December 17th, 2019, we walk into our third neurology appointment at Boston Children's. Matt's wearing a purple Patagonia vest. It's freezing in Boston, and he zips his vest. And Dr. Sid notices Javi's startle, that she startles when she hears that sound of the zipper. And that startle is characteristic of Tay-Sachs. And so Dr. Sid asks us if we've been tested for Tay-Sachs. And we kind of scoff at him and say, whatever's going on with Havi, it's not Tay-Sachs. We were tested for that years ago. And there's just no way. He insists that we do a blood draw during the MRI just to be sure. And lo and behold, we learn that Hav has Tay-Sachs. That later what comes out is that a physician ordering error had been made in Matt's carrier screening test. And so he was misreported as negative when in fact he was a carrier. So at this point, Matt's in the system. He's a physician scientist, and all of his sort of friends, colleagues in the space, not all, many, are sort of saying, you can choose to do everything meaning all the interventions, pursue clinical trials, go in for every swallow study, consider all the orthotics, a feeding tube, all the things, or you can do nothing. And there was definitely some judgment around the nothing. And we chose to do everything, but that everything looked different than what everything looked like in the traditional medical system as Matt knew it and we had experienced it. And so our everything became this idea that sort of came to us in somewhat of a spiritual sort of apocalyptic moment, as theologian Kate Bowler refers to it. Apocalyptic comes from the Greek root to lay bare, reveal, or expose. And in that moment, we said, well, I can't wrap my head around the fact that Javi's going to have only 2 birthdays on this earth. It just didn't make sense as her mom. And so what if we honor Shabbat every Friday? Could we celebrate her birthday on Shabbat too? And Matt sort of jumped in and said, yeah, like a Shabbirthday. We could combine Shabbat and birthday and call them Shabbirthdays. And we could feature her favorite foods, blueberries and cheesy eggs. And we could dance and sing and not pretend the pain away, but we could do everything on those Fridays and surround her with all the love that she deserved. And so we did. And we celebrated 57 of them with her on this earth. We decided, this is the language for my book, that we would celebrate the shit out of her, that she wouldn't have more than 2 birthdays on this earth, but she'd have as many Shabbirthdays as we could possibly squeeze in. And one thing that happened after we came up with this idea that had actually given us a little bit of energy was we went and we saw a rabbi. A handful of our friends and family had advised us to do so, fairly common. Good friends advising their Jewish friends in crisis to go see a rabbi. And so we did. And we told the rabbi about this idea we had for Shabbirthdays, told her all about Javi's tragic diagnosis and our story. And she looked at us and said, I don't think you should do that. I don't think you should move ahead with Shabbirthdays. And we said, why? She said, because how are you going to live on Shabbat after Javi dies? It's going to be too painful. And she was wrong. And she, in that moment, was operating from that place that I referred to a handful of slides ago, from fear of being so close to pain, fear of not knowing what it's like to walk this precarious bridge between the land of the living and the land of the dying, and sort of how to have one foot in each of those lands. And I'm really glad that we had the conviction to trust ourselves and to know that she was sort of wrong in that moment. And that was this sort of real world fear-based response that we lived, which is what motivated my getting into this work, which is what motivated me to write and share our story, so that people could really see that there is a way to show up. There is a way to live so close to the deepest, darkest pain and still come out and still exist in this sort of fully emerged, inhabited way that can be really, really beautiful. But that muting effect, that sort of that fear-based response that says, no, don't let the bottom drop out, that prevents us from sort of letting the top come up too. And so often we live in this really muted space. And I think it's because we don't have practice with that unity of opposites exercise, that notion that we can do both. We can hold hope and heaviness and heartbreak at the same time. This is kind of quintessential Havi with her big eyes and long lashes, and a Shabbirthday celebration with lots of friends and family. And she died on January 20th, 2021 at 9:04 a.m. That timestamp was really important because that's her birthday, September 4th. And she died in my arms on our bed. And we We chose to keep her at home actually for a few days, and then brought her to a funeral home. And sort of in the greatest threshold moment of our lives, we then walked away and were left with, as John O'Donohue calls it, this sort of transfiguring experience of grief. John O'Donohue is a Celtic mystic. His book, Bless the Space Between Us, is like a beautiful companion for, has been a beautiful companion for me in the grief journey. But he writes, it takes only a couple of seconds for a life to change irreversibly. Suddenly we stand on completely strange ground and a new course of life has to be embraced. You look back at the life you've lived up to a few hours before, and it suddenly seems so far away. And everything that was once so steady, so reliable, must find a new way of unfolding. So that's where we were, January 20th, 2021. And the three sort of steadying elements for me, for us, that emerged were really movement, community, and ritual. And I'll talk for just a moment about those three elements on the final slide, and then stop sharing my screen and have what I know is going to be such a rich conversation with Adam, because he's an incredible conversationalist and thinker. But movement, community, and ritual, and this is the approach that the organization I started, which is called Emotion, takes to supporting grieving people. It's worth sharing because I think there's a lot of practices that can be integrated into the medical system, really. But movement, we hear so much about how powerful movement is in healing. But the question for me was why. I was a runner and a soccer player. And so Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a neuroscientist and focuses a lot on trauma, talks about this patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity that exists in movement, and that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity is the strongest somatosensory memory that we have. It's from the time that we were in our mother's womb, when we listen to her heartbeat, that ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. And it's that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity, he explains in much more scientific detail than I am right now, that's really our inherent regulating mechanism. And so it's why movement is so regulating for us. And we can use it as part of our kind of healing journey to allow for that opening, that expansion, to engage in hard, heavy, difficult conversations, thoughts, memories with this sort of built-in support of movement. Community was the second element, and Dr. Joanne Cacciatore, who's a traumatic grief scholar, for anyone who's interested, has a study out that talks about really the four elements of community, of informational support, instrumental, appraisal, and emotional. And we know that community is so important to ensuring that we don't feel lonely and isolated. And yet in grief, sort of how we empower and educate our communities to learn a language of loss so that community can move alongside us, can be with us, is a part of why I think it's so important that folks see examples of communities really, really showing up the way ours did. And ritual, my favorite sort of description of ritual is Suki Miller's The Antidote to Helplessness. And this is again from Dr. Bruce Perry's work. He talks about this dosed, moderate, and predictable exposures to stressors that we know enhance resilience, as opposed to the opposite of prolonged, severe, and unpredictable, which actually makes us vulnerable to stressors. So the question becomes, what are the ways that we integrate grief into our lives? Integrate instead of disintegrate, dis meaning to cut off or exclude. And we integrate really through ritual. Ritual can become the container for these dosed, moderate, and predictable exposures to stressors. And in this case, stressors being having to live without my daughter. And so basic examples are, I make blueberry smoothies every day because when Javi lost the ability to chew, her favorite food had been blueberries. So she went sort of from blueberry pancakes to blueberry smoothies. And so after she died, I needed to hear that blender. I needed to see that vibrant blue purple, and I needed to taste what she had been tasting. And so it was just a smoothie, and it's just a smoothie every morning, but it's so much more, and it really contains so much of my love and heartache. And it's a simple example of these sort of micro rituals that I think really help us to exist. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that was a helpful start, Adam, for us, but thank you.
Before we start talking, can you pull up? There's just one picture that I want you to pull up one more time,
Yeah,
if you wouldn't mind.
of course.
You go back a few slides. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. One more. I think one more back. Yeah, right there. Stop. Go back one more.
Oh,
Forward one more.
forward.
Yeah, that picture all the way on the right is really beautiful.
That's actually wow, that's crazy. That's at Matt and I got married at a family camp in Vermont, Camp Ohana, and we brought Javi there when she was a year, and she's in the sink in our cabin uh, at Ohana. So that was right around when we were starting to get kind of concerned about her progress.
I'd shared with you in an email that like what your book is amazing, but what's missing is these pictures of Javi that like it's like seeing her smile and seeing her face is really precious.
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna pull myself in as a pin also, but I see like some of my favorite med students. There are many amazing med students, but some of my favorite med students are on this call right now. I certainly want to prioritize, like, if you guys want to jump in, feel free to. I have no question after those 25 minutes that you get a sense of why Myra's words have kind of been echoing through my head over the past um, many months since I started reading her book. Feel emotional. I think like that picture of Javi in particular kind of shakes me as a dad. Um, but I think that like obviously we're all very multifaceted. I think that specifically our program is around health, spirituality, and religion. And I think that your book raised for me so many questions around kind of like what we're doing in the hospital or in clinics or whatever it is. Kind of what we're doing that's meaningful and worthwhile, where our limitations are, where we could be doing better. And so I mostly just like want to pick your brain and explore that with you, because you went through this unbelievable nightmare, um, and like you're describing, you had like a real full experience of the worst parts of it and also some amazing things that happened. Um, but I have like so many examples of reading your book of like good moments that you had in the healthcare system. For example, you like were pregnant with Kaya, your daughter, when you found out that Javi had Tay-Sachs, and then so you knew that Kaya could also be affected. There's a 25% chance of her being affected, which is like an unimaginable thing to like be dealing with at the same time. And so you met this Dr. Grant who did CBS, like a genetic testing on that pregnancy. So that's like a high moment. Um, Meeting Dr. Sid and Dr. Sid being like competent is like a high moment as far as encountering the medical system. I actually want to read from one moment that is not a high moment. I think that it speaks to kind of like our maybe my nightmare to the doctor. Um, you're engaged in meeting with the hospice team for the first time on Zoom. Midway through the Zoom call, I'm in the middle of updating the doctor and her team on how Havi is doing when a little chat box pops up at the bottom of the screen. She needs hospice, it reads. It is from the doctor. Immediately on screen, she brings both hands to her mouth, looking horrified and embarrassed. I swallowed hard and finished the sentence. I'm speaking at the time. She quickly and very professionally explains that she had just sent a chat message, one that was meant to be private, to another palliative care team member, to everyone on the call. And then I want to jump down a little bit because you're reflecting here on Matt's emotional response, who went through medical training similar to a lot of the people on our session. Are seeing that message is just another example of the medical system failing to provide the basic quality and humanity of care that we in Havi need. It is an especially difficult moment for Matt, who has worked so hard and so long to become a part of the medical system, which he views with such respect and even awe. You go on to comment that it's called healthcare, but he describes that sometimes it lacks health and care. So those are like the poles of kind of like competence, excellence, delivery, and kind of like a lack of regard for your kind of the importance of the moment to you. Yeah, I want to. It's not so much a question. I just want to hear you kind of reflect on this for a group of aspiring doctors.
Yeah, I think it's actually interesting that you highlighted that section, the one that we were critical, because in the first draft of the book, I left a lot of that out, actually. Like I didn't want any of this to feel like an attack on the medical system. I have so much respect for it and am obviously married to a doctor. And yet what I was told was like, it's really important to sort of highlight so that it can become a teaching opportunity. And, but I just wanted to caveat it by saying like, I just have so much, really so much respect for the work and the training that you're doing. I think that what I have learned now is that there is really there is a way of being, there is a language of loss, there are some kind of practical frameworks to think about how to support and be with families who are experiencing the worst thing. And I think the first basic principle is to learn how to connect and access your own pain, and so that you have a chance of being able to connect with someone else's, even though it's not going to be the exact same type of pain loss. But when we operate from that space, we can do and say and be really different than when we kind of cut ourselves off. And so like that sort of self-awareness of getting to a place of appreciating the depths of someone else's despair, I think is really the essential step. And so many of the people who we interacted with in the healthcare system, even in palliative care, felt really disconnected, and that is so easy to sense. And so that moment, now it's so obvious. Of course, Javi needed hospice care. Like, of course, based on the update I was giving. But had I not seen that and had I instead just been engaged with as a mom and sort of had been asked a follow-up question about anything, oh, it sounds like she's still like enjoying her smoothies. That's like so beautiful. What kind did you make today? Or, oh, she strung together 3 or 4 hours of sleep. Like, did you get some sleep too? Those are, there are so many ways when we can kind of access our humanity, and we don't feel like we're medicalizing, that I think for a grieving parent is just transformative. And yeah, I'll stop there.
I could ask you like questions for 10 hours. I want to make sure that there's time specifically for students to pop in if anybody has anything that they want to.
Please. Anything is on the table.
All right, I'll keep on pausing, keep
Okay.
on pondering. I see Claire and Matt thinking deeply.
Well,
Um,
I have just a
yeah, please go for it, Claire.
well, I have a comment on what you all just said because 2 days ago I met with a surgeon who I like a lot and is a mentor, and we were talking about being emotional as a doctor, and he basically said to me, during residency you have to put your armor on. You don't have any choice. You can't get through it if you don't. And he was talking about how he would have difficult conversations with people and really not be emotionally present at all, and how different it is for him now as an attending. He had just had a very tough conversation that morning with a patient's wife, and he said it's so different. It was very emotional. He said you can't do that in residency. You have to put your arm around to get through it. But just know, Claire, that when you come back to it, you will still be able to feel emotions again. You'll just be a little bit of a different person. Um, I don't know. I I guess that's what I've thought of when I heard what you said, Myra, because that's a conversation within medicine all the time, is how do you draw boundaries? What's appropriate? What do you need to do to get through your day? I'm not saying there's a right answer or not. It's just immediately what I thought of because it's almost a little bit of the opposite advice, at least for training.
No, thank you so much. I think that a graph that comes to my mind is um, on the y-axis, imagine energy exerted over time. And on the x-axis, imagine a state of being that you're in. And there's 3 states of being: avoidance, compartmentalization, and integration. Avoidance is the tallest bar on that graph. It takes the most energy. And that energy that we're exerting, if we're emotionally avoiding, if we're repressing, that is just energy that is being sucked from us. And that energy is looking for places to get stored. And it often gets stored in the forms of ache, illness, other immunities. And so it's not possible to operate in that state of avoidance without it exacting a real toll on us. The question becomes, how do we sort of move between compartmentalization and integration, and what's the difference between those two? And how do we start to practice this skill, which we don't get a lot of practice in, of actually even knowing what we're feeling? Because this idea that like we can't feel because we'll break down is just a result of the fact that we don't get enough practice getting those reps in for learning how to feel. Like I can exist in a totally competent way, professional way, hold hard, heavy things for other clients because I have had so much practice learning what I am feeling and how to get through those reps so then I can exist and function. And I think that that's a big challenge. And I would challenge I sort of challenge the system to integrate emotional literacy into this curriculum, because without it, I'm not surprised that there is so much burnout and fatigue and distancing, because you're right, you can't survive if you absorb everything without the skills to hold them. That's like my initial thought.
Dr. Olterhauser has his hand up. John, I know you probably have a lot to say on this. So for those of you on the call, John is a pulmonary critical care physician here. John?
Yes, so yeah, I want to pick up on a couple of those threads. Myra, thank you so much for this presentation. It is just so meaningful, impactful. It's so important for us as clinicians to hear these stories, to hear patient experiences, to have someone like yourself be so both courageous and vulnerable at the same time to share your story so that we can hear these, because it's so easy, I think, easy and understandable for patients to hold that in and not share these stories back with clinicians. And so many clinicians don't hear the other side. They're not forced to confront them. They don't They don't think about it. They don't, and as a result, they don't necessarily think they're doing something wrong or that it could be done better. So I really am glad we've had this opportunity already to discuss this, and I'm glad, Claire, you shared your experience talking with with the surgical attending, and one of the hats I wear in addition to being in pulmonary and critical care is I teach our communication skills curriculum and our compassionate conversations curriculum to medical students and residents. And so I think a lot about how to get medical professionals to be able to express more empathy, and to express it, you have to feel it. There's no way around it. There's no way around putting on that armor and compartmentalizing things and then actually be able to say something that is meaningfully empathic. And so, but I struggle with how to encourage trainees to tap into that emotion, to tap into that pain. Like you said so beautifully, you have to be able to at least begin to experience or understand what that pain might be like to be most effective in terms of what you're going to say and what you're going to try to do to unpack some of that pain. And what I find is hard is that for me, you talk about this muscle memory. You talk about, hey, I've done this a lot as a patient, as a mother. For me, I've done this a lot as a pulmonary and critical care physician, and I'm also I do a lot of spiritual health, self-care. I think about these things. I do a lot of reading. I'm familiar with this territory, but a lot of our trainees aren't, right? And so I'm cautious about encouraging them to go into that painful environment and to tap into it if they're not practiced, they haven't trained, they haven't worked up to it, or God knows what they're going through at any particular time themselves these days. And so I'm always trying to find that sort of sweet spot, that tension spot between encouraging people to be willing to risk going there, but acknowledging that they need to feel safe when they're in there in order to be effective. And so I don't know if I have really, maybe I'll just leave it sort of as those are my thoughts when I hear this. And so Claire, yes, like, don't be afraid to tap into that. But also you have to train for it. You have to practice spiritual self-care to be most effective. Don't expect that you're just going to walk in, turn on your empathy and jump into an incredibly painful situation and be able to handle it. There needs to be some training to be able to do that effectively. And how to get that kind of training into medical curriculum, I don't know. I wish I had better ideas. But I'll stop for now. Thank you for listening.
Wow. I don't know if I have anything to add. That's so thoughtful, and I feel so grateful that you're in this work, and I'd love to know more about the curriculum. And I guess the only element that I would add is I think sometimes this idea that there's that the medical provider has to hold the pain or has to sort of make the deepest connection. Like, there were so many moments where I didn't really need that from the provider. Like, they weren't my person, I just didn't want it to feel like an uncomfortable situation. And so I do wonder about that element too, like that it's okay if that provider doesn't feel the deepest anguish too. Like, it's not their daughter, it's not their parent, it's not, and yet to sort of, like you said, kind of what are the spiritual self-care practices that they need to know that they've been affected by something, or that they're not expressing how they're feeling or how they're being moved. So yeah, Adam, I don't know if you want to jump in. I feel a little in over my skis now. It's like,
No, not at all. I think one of the things that I learned from your book that I keep on reflecting on is that the healthcare system is a small part of people's experience. We have this illusion that we are the Mecca, that we're at the center, like that the meaningful moments are happening in our presence. And that's partially true. Like you had big moments in the healthcare setting, and then you had Shabbirthdays, and a lot of the emotional support that we expect to provide for people, like you got from Charlie and Blythe, you got from Dr. Joe, you got from Matt, you got from your siblings, right? Like one of the points on your slide was community. And I think that we have this illusion in medicine that we have to be like all things to all people, um, as opposed to thinking like, I have a meaningful role to play in someone's life, and I want to do that gracefully and well. I think about that. Sorry,
No,
go for it.
that is so well said, and um, I think we really felt that. I mean, an example is Dr. Sid certainly wasn't our, and maybe if he's watching this, like he would know he wasn't like our emotional person. He was not a part of our support system at all, and yet I only have the most really positive, even though he gave us the diagnosis. I have all the respect for him, for how he spoke to our family, for how he navigated that day and the days after, um, and then how he sort of faded to the background, actually. And like, I really appreciate that. I think on the other hand, there was and I didn't include this, but it's maybe a helpful example. Our neurologist who was managing Javi's medicine for probably the last 6 or 9 months of her life, which is a large percentage of her life. We met on Zoom a handful of times. We spoke about life and our children. And after Javi died, we never heard from her, not once. I had to go cancel the appointment in the portal, the follow-on appointment, because Javi had died. And so a very, 2 lines from her, or from an assistant, or from the system acknowledging that Javi exists and that she has died, and that it was an honor to be a provider. Like, didn't need to be long, but that, ironically enough, sort of stings, even though she was such a small part. So I guess there are, it feels like there are these subtle, simple ways. Maybe it feels simple, but it's not, to kind of integrate some practices into the system that could hold families differently.
I almost feel like part of this challenge or the struggle is like um I think like if you talk you described the burnout phenomenon, and like I think doctors are really tired generally speaking, like feel really overtaxed. Um and in the past week I diagnosed 2 women with breast cancer, and I've reached out to them more than once. Um and on a very deep level, I recognize that I don't have the bandwidth to like continue that. Like additional bad things will happen that come across my computer screen that I'm like, oh, now this takes my attention to this. Um, so I think that like I almost feel like I owe you an apology on behalf of the medical system of um, like I don't know what's going on in that neurologist's life, like to what extent they're a caring person, to what extent um, they're like overwhelmed. Like I don't have a sense of it, and I'm sure that I'm guilty of that, of like terrible things happen and I'm not aware of it, or terrible things happen and I don't have the bandwidth to address it.
We all are. Yeah.
Um, uh, Adam, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Doug. Well, again, thank you for your talk. I had to step out for a minute, so I might have missed this, but you said that your husband genetic test was done incorrectly. I'm just curious, have you circled back, or have you done anything relative to what happened to that erroneous test result, or who did it, or how does that feel for you and your husband?
Yeah, we did, and as a result, there's been a change made within the Harvard system here to prevent that particular error from ever happening again. And so, yeah, that part of it feels hard and sad, and also like there was some progress made to ensure that that particular error wouldn't affect another family.
But on the just to follow up, on the one hand, um, if you had known that, you might not have had Javi. But having had Javi and looking back, how do you, I don't know if you've thought about that or reconciled that in your mind. I don't know if that's making any sense or not.
No, we get this question somewhat often. It's an incredibly difficult question, near impossible, and I appreciate it. I think that what Matt and I have come to and sort of believe is that had the error not been made, we would have had Javi without Tay-Sachs, and that would have been the greatest gift. And yet it's impossible to go back in time. It's impossible to not have fallen in love and continue to be in love with our daughter. And yet, no child should ever be born with Tay-Sachs, given what we know and how we can test. And it's the cruelest disease, one of. So I hope that answers or comes close.
Thank you. Thank you.
One, I was just texting out to say thank you. I think one of my reflections in general, being a doctor, and I think it rings true reading your book and hearing you speak today, is I think that we live in a society where like I literally can have almost anything I want whenever I want it. Like I wanted a new hat and like I pushed a button and then it came to my house and now I have the hat. Like our consumerist culture like treats the world around us as if it's like ours to be enjoyed. And I think like what happened to your family is particularly tragic, but also speaks to the deeper reality of like this is what it is to be human. That like um we suffer and there's inevitability of pain and suffering. Um I know that our time is short. I think that throughout this conversation, I've been mostly reflecting through the lens of being a doctor. I reflected at the beginning through the lens of being a dad. I think just also as a person who like I recognize that suffering will come my way at some point again. I hope that I have the strength to kind of like confront that with the grace and thoughtfulness that you have. Since this is a health, spirituality, and religion thing, I think one of the ideas of religion or spirituality is that like people who came before us kind of reflected on big, hard questions. And I think that you like really leaned into that in a way that's like really amazing, right? Like instead of just being like, I'm here and alone and this is painful, kind of like you're in conversation with people who are alive and not alive, who have kind of like gone through loss and grief and love and connectedness. And I don't know, in many ways, you're like, I think that like as a teacher and as a doctor, I'm supposed to have my shit together and like have things kind of figured out and organized. And in many ways, I like read this book and I was like, wow, you like understand something very deep about being a brave person in the face of complexity. For that, I'm like really grateful, and I'm really grateful for you sharing your story.
Wow, thank you so much. I feel really honored to be here, and even though I can't see a lot of the people on the screen, I thank you for sharing this time and space, and Adam for reading and absorbing and caring enough and trusting me with your community, and it just means everything. So, oh, Margot, I know Margot joins we host monthly virtual sacred circles for those of us who have a person who we want to honor. And yeah, so wow. So thank you all. I hope we
Um,
stay in touch somehow. And John, it was really a gift to hear about your work. So I'll follow up to find out more.
Yeah, feel free to email me, or I'll see if I can find your email. I have something else maybe to share with you, so that'd be
Cool.
good. If you don't hear back from me, I'm leaving vacation in like 3 hours, so it might be
Good.
like.
Get out of here. Good.
And then I'm going to shamelessly plug Myra's book because I think that it is worth reading.
Really nice.
yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. So that's in the chat.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Myra.
Okay,
Appreciate
thank
you.
all. Yeah. Back at you.